In December 1941, the world is shaken as Japan launches an attack on Pearl Harbor, leading the United States to enter the conflict. In this discussion, we clarify our goals. We explore the decisions and events that set the stage for this shocking moment, then follow the swift developments across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. We begin with the code intercepts in Washington, the ignored warnings, and Yamamoto's strategic decision to strike first. We recount the details of the Pearl Harbor attack, including the absence of the aircraft carriers and the destruction caused. From that point, we examine the coordinated assaults that occurred that same week. The devastation of airfields in the Philippines, the brief stand at Wake Island, the capture of Guam, the siege of Hong Kong, and the initial actions in Malaya. We also discuss the sinking of the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, Japan's advance southward for oil through Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, the path to the fall of Singapore, and the expanding conflict in Burma. Finally, we frame this within the broader global context as Hitler declares war on the United States, the Soviet counteroffensive begins near Moscow, and President Roosevelt gives the go-ahead for atomic research. By the conclusion, you will understand why December 1941 marks a pivotal turning point in the war. On December 6, 1941, just as the Soviet counteroffensive around Moscow commenced, United States Navy cryptanalysts decoded a message between Tokyo and the Japanese ambassador in Washington. Although the last part of the message was missing, the meaning was crystal clear. "This means war," President Roosevelt stated to Harry Hopkins, who was in the Oval Office that evening when the interception was delivered. The president had only recently sent a personal communication to Emperor Hirohito, urging Japan to de-escalate its involvement in the conflict. Meanwhile, at the War Department, the head of intelligence forwarded the intercepts to Brigadier General Leonard Jarrow of the War Plans Division, instructing him to alert the bases in the Pacific. However, Jarrow chose to take no action, believing that they had received sufficient notification. "I think they have had plenty of notification," he noted. This stance was partly based on the fact that United States Navy and United States Army headquarters in the Pacific had been informed on the 27th of November that war was looming. This intelligence had also stemmed from the code intercepts of Japanese diplomatic communications. Interestingly, or perhaps notably, no warnings had been issued by the Soviet Union, despite President Roosevelt's intention to assist them. It is difficult to determine Stalin's true intentions, but he chose not to share Richard Sorge's intelligence with the Americans before the battle for Moscow, which indicated that Japan was preparing to launch a surprise attack on American forces in the Pacific. One of the most notable coincidences of the Second World War occurred when President Franklin Roosevelt decided on the 6th of December, 1941, the day prior to the Japanese attack, to proceed with the atomic weapon research project. In early September, Japan's military leaders compelled Emperor Hirohito to accept their decision to engage in war. His only objection was to recite a peace-promoting poem authored by his grandfather. However, Hirohito's role as the commander of the armed forces was quite ambiguous. His resistance to the war stemmed not from moral grounds, but from a worry over the possibility of failure. The extreme militarists, primarily junior and mid-level officers, were convinced that the nation had a divine obligation to establish an empire, which they euphemistically referred to as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This was reminiscent of a warning issued in 1934 by the astute American ambassador in Tokyo, who described a potential Pax Japonica. By November 1941, Hirohito feared that the military was set to lead the nation toward national harakiri. Japan's ambition for imperial expansion created mixed priorities: the ongoing conflict in China, animosity towards the Soviet Union to the north, and the chance to capture the French, Dutch, and British colonies to the south. The foreign minister Matsuoka Yosuke had arranged a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union in April 1941, just before Hitler's invasion. Once German forces began advancing rapidly east, Matsuoka reversed his position and proposed a strike against the Soviet rear. However, senior commanders in the Imperial Japanese Army rejected this idea. They recalled their defeat against Zhukov in August 1939 and most preferred to conclude the conflict in China first. The occupation of French Indochina in 1940 was primarily aimed at halting supplies to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, yet this move became the critical step toward the Strike South strategy, mainly advocated by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Indochina offered an ideal location from which to capture the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Following the embargo placed on Japan by both the American and British governments in response to their occupation of Indochina, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the commander of the Imperial Fleet, was warned that his ships would exhaust their fuel within a year. The Japanese militarists believed they had to press forward to capture everything they needed, as retreat would lead to an unbearable loss of honor. General Togo Hideki, the Minister of War, recognized that confronting the United States, with its immense industrial capabilities, posed a significant risk. Yamamoto, who also feared the repercussions of a drawn-out conflict with the United States, believed their only hope for survival lay in launching a preemptive massive attack. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Britain, I will achieve remarkable victories, he accurately predicted. After that, I hold no expectation of success. The military leaders outwardly accepted the Emperor's and Prime Minister Prince Konoe Fumimaro's preference for a diplomatic resolution with the United States, but had no intention of agreeing to any terms that required major concessions. The Imperial Army firmly opposed any withdrawal from China. While they were often resigned to their fate, particularly if the conflict continued, Japan's military commanders favored the peril of national suicide over the loss of dignity. President Franklin D. Roosevelt believed that a strong stance was the best approach, even though he did not desire war at that moment. Both General George C. Marshall and Admiral Harold R. Stark, the chiefs of staff for the Army and Navy, had clearly warned him that the United States was not adequately prepared. However, his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, was infuriated upon learning on November 25th about a sizable convoy of warships and troop transports moving through the South China Sea. He responded with a series of demands, perceived in Tokyo as an ultimatum. Hull's document laid out 10 points that included a demand for Japan to withdraw from Indochina and China, as well as to renounce the tripartite pact with Germany. This stern response was influenced by the Chinese nationalists and the British. Only a complete and immediate concession by the United States and Britain might have prevented conflict at that time, but such a display of Western weakness would likely have incited further Japanese aggression. Hull's stubbornness reinforced the belief among Japanese military leaders that their preparations for war were justified. They felt that delays would only weaken their position, and putting off the conflict would reduce Japan, as had been stated at the crucial conference on November 5th, to a third-class nation. Meanwhile, Yamamoto's carrier fleet had set out from the Kuril Islands, targeting Pearl Harbor. The strike was scheduled for 8 in the morning on December 8th, Tokyo time. The Japanese strategy focused on establishing a perimeter around the Western Pacific and the South China Sea, with 5 armies tasked to capture key objectives. The 25th Army would push down the Malay Peninsula to capture the British naval base in Singapore. The 23rd Army, stationed in southern China, would take Hong Kong. The 14th Army planned to land in the Philippines, where General Douglas MacArthur, the American commander-in-chief, had his headquarters. The 15th Army would invade Thailand and southern Burma. The 16th Army would capture the Dutch East Indies, known today as Indonesia, focusing on the oil fields essential for Japan's war effort. Despite significant reservations from his colleagues in the Imperial Japanese Navy, Admiral Yamamoto argued that some of these operations, especially the attack on the Philippines, were at risk unless he first sent his carrier fleet to eliminate the United States fleet. Yamamoto's Navy pilots had been training for months, practicing torpedo and bombing attacks. Intelligence regarding their targets came from the Japanese Consul General in Honolulu, who had been monitoring the movements of United States warships, which were regularly in harbor on weekends. The preemptive strike was set for shortly after dawn on Sunday, December 8th, which still fell on December 7th in Washington. At dawn on November 26, the carrier force, led by the flagship Akagi, departed under strict radio silence from the Kuril Islands. In Hawaii, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was troubled by the lack of knowledge among his intelligence staff regarding the positions of the carriers from the Japanese First and Second Fleets. He questioned, on December 2nd, if they could be rounding Diamond Head near the entrance to Pearl Harbor without any awareness of it. Yet even Kimmel could not fathom an attack on Hawaii situated in the vast Pacific. Like the military leaders in Washington, he was convinced that a Japanese assault was far more likely to occur around the South China Sea, targeting Malaya, Thailand, or the Philippines. Thus, life went on as usual, with officers dressed in their white tropical uniforms and sailors excitedly anticipating a weekend spent enjoying beers and leisure time on Waikiki Beach with local women. Many ships operated with barely enough crew members over the weekend. At 6:05 in the morning on Sunday, December 8th, a green lamp signaled on the flight deck of the Akagi. Pilots adjusted their hachimaki, the white headbands emblazoned with a red rising sun symbol on the forehead, a pledge to sacrifice their lives for the Emperor. Cheers of banzai erupted from the ground crews as each aircraft took to the sky. Despite the rough seas, the 6 carriers in the task force launched an initial wave of 183 planes, including Zero fighters, Nakajima bombers, torpedo planes, and Aichi dive bombers, with the island of Oahu lying 370 kilometers to the south. The aircraft circled above the carrier fleet, then formed up and headed toward their target. As dawn broke, flying above the clouds made it difficult to monitor their drift, prompting the bomber leader, Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, to tune into the American radio station from Honolulu, which was broadcasting dance music. He then activated his direction finder and adjusted their course by 5 degrees. The music was soon interrupted by a weather update, which reassured him that visibility over the islands was improving, with some breaks in the clouds. An hour and a half after taking off, the lead pilot spotted the northern tip of the island. The reconnaissance plane that had gone ahead communicated that the Americans seemed unaware of their approach. Fuchida fired a black dragon flare from his cockpit, signaling that they could continue with the plan for a surprise attack. The reconnaissance plane then noted the presence of 10 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 10 light cruisers. As they neared Pearl Harbor, Fuchida used binoculars to examine the anchorage. At 7:49 in the morning, he gave the order to proceed and relayed the message, "Tora, Tora, Tora!" back to the Japanese carrier fleet, a code word meaning tiger, indicating that total surprise had been attained. 2 groups of dive bombers, totaling 53 aircraft, veered off to assault the 3 nearby airfields, while the torpedo planes dove into low-level attacks against the 7 capital ships in Battleship Row. Honolulu radio continued to play music. Fuchida could already see waterspouts erupting near the battleships. He instructed his pilot to maneuver, signaling his 10 squadrons to line up for their bombing run. He admired the beautiful formation. However, as they approached, American anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Dark gray explosions erupted around them, causing the aircraft to shudder. The first torpedoes struck the battleship USS Oklahoma, which began to tilt over. More than 400 men lost their lives, trapped beneath the hull. Fuchida was surprised by the rapid American response as his aircraft flew toward the USS Nevada at a height of 3,000 meters. He regretted his decision to attack in a straight line. They were shaken as the USS Arizona erupted in a massive explosion, taking more than 1,000 men with it. The thick black smoke from burning oil caused many aircraft to overshoot their bombing targets and return for a second approach. Part of Fuchida's group of dive bombers and fighters diverted to target the United States Army Air Corps bases at Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, and the Naval Air Station on Ford Island. Ground crews and pilots were having breakfast when the attack commenced. The first man to respond at Hickam Field was an Army chaplain who was outside preparing his altar for an open-air service. He grabbed a nearby machine gun, set it on his altar, and began firing at the attacking enemy planes. However, at both bases, the aircraft neatly lined up by the runway made easy targets for the Japanese pilots. Nearly an hour after the first planes had spotted their targets, A second wave of Japanese attackers arrived, but their mission was tougher due to the thick smoke and heavy fire. Even 5-inch naval guns were firing at the aircraft, and some shells reportedly landed in the town of Honolulu, claiming civilian lives. Suddenly, the sky was clear. The Japanese pilots had turned back to the north to return to their carriers, already making their way home. Including the battleships Arizona and Oklahoma, the United States Navy at Pearl Harbor lost 2 destroyers. Another 3 battleships were sunk or grounded, but were later salvaged and repaired, while 3 more sustained damage. The Army Air Corps and Navy lost 188 aircraft destroyed and 159 damaged. In total, 2,335 American servicemen were killed and 1,143 wounded. Only 29 Japanese aircraft had been lost. However, the Imperial Navy also suffered the loss of an ocean-going submarine and 5 midget submarines, which were meant to serve as a distraction. Despite the shock from the attack, many sailors and shipyard workers in Hawaii immediately jumped into the water to rescue those thrown off the ships. Most of the individuals struggling in the harbor were coated in oil and required their skin to be cleaned with cotton waste. Small groups armed with oxyacetylene cutters began to slice through bulkheads and hulls to free trapped comrades. Around them were damaged warships engulfed in black smoke, distorted cranes along the docks, and port buildings peppered with holes. It would take 2 weeks to extinguish the last of the fires. Anger fueled everyone in their efforts to restore the fighting strength of the United States Pacific Fleet. They did find some solace in knowing that none of the aircraft carriers were docked, as they would provide the only means to retaliate in a naval conflict that had changed forever. Pearl Harbor was far from the sole target. Bombers from the Imperial Air Fleet had been poised to depart from the island of Formosa to strike American airfields in the Philippines, but thick fog had kept them grounded. General Douglas MacArthur had been roused in his suite at a hotel in Manila with news of the Pearl Harbor attack. He promptly called a staff meeting at his headquarters. Major General Louis Brereton, leader of the Far East Air Force, sought permission to deploy his B-17 flying fortresses against the airfields on Formosa. Yet MacArthur hesitated, having been informed that the Japanese bombers stationed there lacked the range to reach the Philippines. Brereton was not convinced. He sent his B-17s into the air, accompanied by fighter escorts, to ensure they would not be caught on the ground. Eventually, MacArthur permitted a reconnaissance flight over Formosa to be followed by a bombing mission the next day. Brereton directed his bombers to return to Clark Field for refueling, about 90 kilometers from Manila, while the fighters were instructed to land at their base near Iba to the northwest. At 12:20 p.m., local time, while the crews were having lunch, the Japanese attackers appeared overhead. They could hardly believe their fortune in discovering their targets perfectly lined up. In total, 18 B-17 bombers and 53 P-40 fighters were destroyed. Half of the Far East Air Force was eliminated on that first day. The Americans were caught off guard because their radar system had not yet been set up. Meanwhile, other Japanese bombers targeted the capital, Manila, leaving Philippine civilians unsure of how to respond. An American Marine observed women gathered under acacia trees in the park, with some opening their umbrellas for extra protection. Wake Island, located between Hawaii and the Mariana Islands, faced an attack from Japanese aircraft on December 8th, but the Americans were prepared. Major James Devereux, leading the 427 U.S. Marines stationed there, had instructed his bugler to sound the call to arms as soon as he learned of the assault on Pearl Harbor. 4 Marine pilots flying Grumman Wildcats succeeded in shooting down 6 Zero fighters, despite the loss or damage of 8 Wildcats on the ground. On December 11th, Japanese warships approached to land troops, but the Marines used their 5-inch guns to sink 2 destroyers and damage the cruiser Yubari. The Japanese forces retreated without even attempting to disembark their Marines. Although thrilled by their remarkable success, the U.S. Marines on Wake Island understood that the Japanese would return in even larger numbers. On December 23rd, a significantly larger task force arrived, this time with 2 aircraft carriers and 6 cruisers. The Marines bravely defended against overwhelming odds, supported by heavy naval bombardment and airstrikes. Though they inflicted substantial losses on the enemy, the Americans ultimately had to surrender to prevent severe civilian casualties on the island. On December 10th, 5,400 Japanese Marines landed on Guam, situated in the Mariana Islands, about 2,500 kilometers east of Manila. The small and lightly equipped garrison of U.S. Marines did not stand a chance. The British in Hong Kong and Malaya had anticipated a Japanese invasion since late November. Malaya, rich in tin and extensive rubber plantations, was deemed a valuable target. The governor, Sir Shenton Thomas, referred to the region as the dollar arsenal of the empire. As a result, Malaya was almost as vital to the Japanese as the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. A state of emergency was declared in Singapore on December 1st, but the British remained woefully unprepared. The colonial authorities worried that an overly aggressive response might disturb the local population. The disturbing complacency of colonial society fostered a self-delusion largely rooted in arrogance. A critical misjudgment of their opponents included the belief that all Japanese soldiers were extremely short-sighted and inherently inferior to Western forces. In reality, they were remarkably resilient and had been indoctrinated to believe there was no greater honor than sacrificing their lives for their emperor. Their leaders, infused with a sense of racial superiority and convinced of Japan's rightful dominion over East Asia, ignored the glaring contradiction that their war aimed to liberate the region from Western oppression. The Royal Navy possessed a vast and state-of-the-art naval base on the northeast corner of Singapore Island. Strong coastal defenses were ready to thwart any amphibious assault, yet this impressive establishment, which consumed a significant portion of the naval budget, was almost deserted. The initial strategy had called for dispatching a fleet from Britain if war broke out. However, due to naval obligations in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, along with the need to protect Arctic supply convoys to Murmansk for the Soviet Union, no battle fleet was present in the Far East. Winston Churchill's commitment to support the Soviet Union also meant that the Far East Command was lacking modern aircraft and tanks, among other essential equipment. The only available fighter, the Brewster Buffalo, nicknamed the Flying Beer Barrel for its stout shape and sluggish performance, stood no chance against the Japanese Zeros. The British commander in Malaya was Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, a tall, slender man who sported a military mustache that did little to distract from his prominent teeth and weak chin. While Percival had gained an arguably undeserved reputation for harshness with Irish Republican Army prisoners during the Troubles, he displayed the stubbornness of a timid leader when engaging with subordinate commanders. Lieutenant General Sir Lewis Heath, who led the 3rd Indian Corps, held no regard for Percival and was deeply resentful of his promotion over him. Relations among the various Army and Royal Air Force leaders, as well as with the volatile and paranoid Australian commander, Major General Henry Gordon Bennett, were far from friendly. In theory, Percival commanded nearly 90,000 men, yet fewer than 60,000 were frontline troops. Hardly any had jungle experience, and the Indian battalions and local volunteers were nearly untrained. The dismal state of British defenses was well recognized in Tokyo. 3,000 Japanese civilians living in Malaya had been relaying detailed intelligence through their consulate general in Singapore. On December 2nd, a squadron from the Royal Navy, led by the small in stature Admiral Sir Thomas Phillips, arrived in Singapore. The squadron included the modern battleship HMS Prince of Wales, the older battlecruiser HMS Repulse, and 4 destroyers. However, it was missing fighter cover, as the aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable, with its 45 Hurricanes, was undergoing repairs. Yet the British in Singapore seemed unconcerned. They believed the Japanese would not dare to invade Malaya with such formidable ships present. General Percival, on the other hand, was adamant against constructing defense lines, claiming it would lower the offensive spirit of his troops. On Saturday, December 6th, a Royal Australian Air Force bomber, stationed in the far northeast of Malaya at Kota Bharu, spotted Japanese transport ships guarded by warships. These vessels had set off from Hainan, an island off the southern coast of China, and were set to be joined by 2 convoys from Indochina. This force would split up again, targeting the southern Thai ports of Patani and Singora on the Kra Isthmus, along with the airbase at Kota Bharu. From the Kra Isthmus, General Yamashita Tomoyuki's 25th Army planned to advance both northwest towards southern Burma and south into Malaya. The British had developed a plan called Operation Matador to push into southern Thailand and stall the Japanese forces there. However, the Thai government, facing the inevitable, had effectively accepted Japanese dominance in hopes of reclaiming territory in northwestern Cambodia. Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham, the senior commander of Far East forces, was uncertain about whether to go ahead with Operation Matador. He was often referred to as Pop-Off due to his habit of dozing off in meetings. General Heath was infuriated by this indecision, as his Indian troops remained on standby to enter Thailand when they should have been heading to Jitra in the far northwest to set up defensive positions. Their morale was plummeting, drenched in the monsoon rains. Finally, in the early hours of December 8th, word came to Singapore that the Japanese were landing to assault Kota Bharu. At 4:30 in the morning, as senior commanders and the governor held a meeting, Japanese bombers launched their first attack on Singapore. The city was still filled with bright lights. Admiral Phillips, fully aware of the absence of fighter cover, chose to move his squadron up the east coast of Malaya to confront the Japanese invasion fleet. In Kota Bharu, the only explosions to have occurred at that point were due to mines on the beach being triggered by stray dogs or falling coconuts. A short distance inland, the 8th Brigade had gathered 1 battalion around the airfield, yet the beaches were defended by only 2 battalions stretched over a distance of 50 kilometers. The Japanese offensive commenced around midnight on December 7th, which was actually about an hour prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, even though they were meant to happen simultaneously. The seas during this monsoon season were rough, but that did not prevent the Japanese from making landfall. The Indian infantry platoons managed to take down several attackers, but they were too widely dispersed, and the visibility in the heavy rain was poor. The Australian pilots at the airstrip scrambled their 10 operational Hudson bombers to strike at the transports offshore, destroying one, damaging another, and sinking several landing barges. However, after dawn, the airfield in Kota Bharu and others along the coast began to face relentless assaults from Japanese Zeros coming in from French Indochina. By the end of the day, the British and Australian squadrons in Malaya had dwindled to just 50 aircraft. Percival's initial decision to prioritize troop deployment to guard airfields turned out to be a serious blunder. Additionally, Brooke Popham's uncertainty regarding Operation Matador resulted in the Japanese Air Force soon operating from bases in southern Thailand. General Heath, to Percival's frustration, initiated a retreat from the northeast the following day. President Roosevelt, echoing his famous remark that December 7th was a date which will live in infamy, sent a cable to Churchill in London announcing the declaration of war passed by the Senate and the House of Representatives. Today, all of us are in the same boat with you and the people of the Empire, and it is a ship which will not and cannot be sunk. It was an unfortunate metaphor as HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were making their way out of the naval base, accompanied by their destroyers. As Admiral Phillips departed, he received a warning that fighter protection would not be available and that Japanese bombers were now stationed in southern Thailand. Phillips believed that, in accordance with the finest traditions of the service, he could not retreat. Phillips' Force Z was not detected by Japanese seaplanes until the late afternoon of December 9th. Not finding any transports or warships, Phillips chose to turn back that evening and head to Singapore. However, in the early hours of December 10th, his flagship received word of another landing at Kuantan, which was on their route. The Royal Navy warships of Force Z were ordered to action stations after a quick breakfast of ham and marmalade sandwiches. Gun crews, donning anti-flash gear, steel helmets, goggles, and asbestos gloves, manned the pom-poms. An observer aboard the Repulse wrote, "The Prince of Wales looked magnificent. White-tipped waves surged over her plunging bows. The waves cloaked her in watery lace, rising and falling in a rhythmic dance. She rose and fell so consistently that watching her became hypnotic. The fresh breeze unfurled her white ensign like a banner. I felt a rush of excitement at the thought of her and the rest of the force taking on enemy landing parties and their escorting warships. In truth, the report of landings at Kuantan turned out to be false. This diversion and delay in their return would have dire consequences. Later that morning, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft was spotted. At 11:15 in the morning, the Prince of Wales opened fire at a small group of enemy aircraft. A few minutes later, another group of torpedo planes appeared. The two ships' multiple pom-pom guns began firing. Their crews affectionately nicknamed them Chicago Pianos. The glowing tracers arched outward in shallow curves towards their targets. But while the gunners were focused on the torpedo planes, they failed to notice bombers at a much higher altitude. The Repulse was hit by a bomb that penetrated the catapult deck. Smoke billowed from the hole. Yet the attention remained on the attacking aircraft. As the pom-pom gunners brought down one of the low-flying attackers, cheers erupted. "Duck down!" But then, emphasizing the more immediate threat, a Marine bugler sounded the grim alert of ship on fire. Fire hoses sprayed onto the hole, emitting thick black smoke, but they were not very effective. The next wave of enemy aircraft targeted the Prince of Wales. A torpedo struck her stern, creating a towering column of water and smoke. The massive ship began to list to port. It hardly seems believable that those seemingly fragile aircraft could inflict such damage, the observer on the battleship Repulse remarked, still struggling to accept the reality that the era of the battleship had truly ended. Even if the aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable had been present, it is questionable whether her planes would have been enough to fend off the relentless Japanese onslaught. With her steering gear and engines incapacitated, HMS Prince of Wales was doomed as yet another wave of torpedo bombers approached. The gun crews on Repulse did their utmost to disrupt the attack, but 3 more torpedoes struck home. The battleship leaned increasingly to one side. It was clear that she was on the verge of sinking. Then, Repulse herself was hit by 2 torpedoes in quick succession. The command to abandon ship was given. There was minimal panic. Some sailors even managed to light up one last cigarette as they lined up. When their moment came, they took a deep breath and jumped into the dark, oil-slicked waters below. Winston Churchill, who had taken pride in the formidable ships of the Royal Navy since his days as First Lord of the Admiralty, was shocked by the disaster. The tragedy struck him even deeper, following his trip aboard the Prince of Wales to Newfoundland in August. The Imperial Japanese Navy now held uncontested dominance in the Pacific. Adolf Hitler celebrated the news. It set a favorable tone for his declaration of war against the United States, announced on December 11th. Hitler had always expected to confront America eventually, and now believed that, faced with its small military and turmoil in the Pacific, it would struggle to play a significant role in Europe for nearly the next 2 years. He was particularly encouraged by Admiral Dönitz, who intended to unleash his submarine packs against American supply lines. Unleashing unrestricted submarine warfare might still bring Britain to its knees. Hitler's announcement to the Reichstag led Nazi representatives to leap to their feet, cheering. They perceived the United States as the predominant Jewish power in the West. Yet, German officers, still engaged in a desperate retreat on the Eastern Front, were uncertain how to process the news. The more perceptive sensed that this global conflict, with the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union united against them, was unlikely to be winnable. The setbacks before Moscow, coupled with America's entry into the war, marked December 20th, 41 as a critical geopolitical turning point. From that point on, Germany lost its chance to win the Second World War outright, even though it still had the capability to deliver devastating destruction and loss of life. On December 16th, General Feldmarschall von Bock, suffering from a psychosomatic ailment, told Hitler he needed to make a choice. Should Army Group Center stay and fight or pull back? Both options risked annihilation. He clearly wanted to be freed from his unsuccessful command and was replaced a few days later by Kluge, who initially supported Hitler's decision not to retreat. Brauchitsch, the army's commander-in-chief, was also dismissed for his pessimistic outlook. Hitler quickly took over the role himself. Several other high-ranking commanders were also let go. but the dismissal of Guderian, known for his aggressive tactics, hit the German officers the hardest. Guderian had typically ignored orders to hold positions at all costs. The wisdom of Hitler's decision to hold firm has been debated for years. Did it prevent a catastrophic failure similar to 1812, or did it lead to massive, unnecessary losses? On December 24th, German soldiers far from their homeland felt the urge to celebrate Christmas, even amidst dire conditions. They easily found Christmas trees, which they adorned with stars made from the silver paper of cigarette packs. In some instances, Russian peasants even provided them with candles. Huddled together for warmth in villages that had not yet been reduced to ashes, they exchanged small gifts and sang Silent Night. While they felt fortunate to be alive after so many of their comrades had perished, they also experienced a profound loneliness as they thought of their families back home. Only a few understood the irony of German sentimentality in the midst of the brutal war they had instigated. On Christmas Day, the prisoner of war camp outside Kaluga was evacuated in temperatures dropping below -30 degrees. Many Soviet prisoners, some driven to cannibalism, collapsed in the snow and were shot. It was perhaps not surprising that Soviet soldiers took revenge by killing German wounded left behind during the retreat, in at least one instance by drenching them in fuel and setting them ablaze. Nobody was more aware of the dramatic shift in global dynamics than Joseph Stalin. His eagerness for revenge against the Germans and his desire to take advantage of their retreat pushed him to call for a general offensive across the entire front. However, the Red Army simply did not have the necessary vehicles, artillery, supplies, and most importantly, training to carry out such an operation. Zhukov was alarmed, even though the operations had exceeded his expectations up to that point. The overly ambitious plans from the Stavka aimed to destroy both Army Group Center and Army Group North, as well as execute a significant push back into Ukraine. After enduring so many months of hardship, the sentiment among the Soviet people shifted dramatically toward unwarranted optimism. Many were convinced, "We'll finish this by spring." Yet, like their leader, they were unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. The British colony of Hong Kong, which had maintained a stance of neutrality during the preceding 4 years of the Sino-Japanese War to the north, was a clear target. Besides its wealth, Hong Kong served as a crucial supply route for nationalist forces. Similar to Singapore, the Japanese community had provided detailed intelligence on the colony's defenses and vulnerabilities to Tokyo. Plans for its takeover had been under consideration for the past 2 years. A fifth column, largely comprised of heavily bribed triad gangs, had also been established. The British community, after years of dominating rule, had no confidence in whether the Hong Kong Chinese, the refugees from Kwangtung province, the Indians, or even the Eurasians would remain loyal. Consequently, they failed to inform these groups about the situation and hesitated to arm them for resistance against the Japanese. Instead, they chose to rely on the 12,000 British and Dominion troops, along with the Hong Kong Volunteer Defense Corps, which was predominantly European. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists offered assistance in defending Hong Kong, but the British were very hesitant to accept, knowing that Chiang aimed to reclaim the colony for China. Ironically, British officers ended up fostering stronger ties with Chinese communist partisans, even supplying them with arms and explosives, which deeply upset the nationalists. Both the communists and the nationalists doubted that the British would prefer to lose Hong Kong to the Japanese rather than to the Chinese. Churchill understood the military reality without illusions. If the Japanese invaded, he believed there was no hope of holding or relieving Hong Kong. Pressure from the Americans led him to strengthen the colony, demonstrating solidarity with the similarly endangered Philippines. On November 15th, 2,000 Canadian soldiers arrived to bolster the garrison. Though inexperienced, they anticipated the grim fate that awaited them if the Japanese army launched an attack. They were skeptical of the Allied strategy to defend the colony for up to 90 days, intending to buy time for the United States Navy at Pearl Harbor to render assistance. On December 8th, as Japanese forces began their occupation of Shanghai, Japanese aircraft struck Kai Tak Airfield, destroying the colony's 5 aircraft. A division of Lieutenant General Sakai Takashi's 23rd Army crossed the Shamchun River, marking the border of the new territories. British Commander Major General C.M. Maltby and his troops were caught off guard. Aside from sabotaging a few bridges, his forces quickly retreated to what was known as the Gin Drinkers' line of defense across the isthmus of the new territories. The lightly equipped and camouflaged Japanese advanced swiftly and quietly on their rubber-soled shoes, while the defenders trudged through the rocky hills in heavy ammunition boots and full battle gear. Triad members and supporters of the Chinese puppet leader Wang Qingwei guided Japanese troops behind the defensive lines. Maltby had only placed a quarter of his forces in the new territories, while the majority remained on Hong Kong Island, expecting an attack from the sea that never materialized. The Chinese population in Hong Kong felt that this was not their conflict. The food rationing and air raid shelters organized by colonial authorities failed to meet their needs. Auxiliary drivers abandoned their vehicles, while Chinese police and air raid precaution personnel discarded their uniforms and went home. Hotel staff and household servants also vanished. Fifth columnists incited trouble in the refugee camps filled with those fleeing the war in China, stealing all the rice. Before long, riots and looting broke out, led by triad gangs. A large Japanese flag was raised over the tall Peninsula Hotel near the Kowloon waterfront, causing panic among some Canadian soldiers who feared they had been outflanked. By midday on December 11th, General Maltby realized he had no option but to withdraw all his troops back across the harbor to Hong Kong Island. Chaos erupted as crowds surged towards the departing boats. The news of the sinking of the Prince of Wales and the repulse shattered any hopes for relief from a Royal Navy task force. The island was in turmoil after relentless artillery fire and bombings by Japanese aircraft. Sabotage from traders added to the panic. British police began apprehending Japanese residents and arrested numerous saboteurs, some of whom were executed on the spot. In response to the crisis, the British turned to Chiang Kai-shek's representative in Hong Kong, Admiral Chan Chak, who had lost a leg. His network of paid vigilantes was enlisted to help restore order and combat the triads, who were planning to attack the European population. Bribery proved to be an effective strategy. Triad leaders convened at the Cecil Hotel, presenting unreasonable demands, but a deal was eventually reached. Admiral Chan Chak's vigilantes, known as the Loyal and Righteous Charitable Association, quickly grew to a force of 15,000, with 1,000 members linked to the special branch. An underground conflict began against Wang Qingwei's supporters, with many captured being executed in back alleys. The British developed a fondness for the resourceful Chinese admiral, who had turned the tide and ultimately decided to seek assistance from the nationalist armies. With whispers of relief and a semblance of order returning, the morale on the besieged island improved. However, Lieutenant General Maltby, unsure of where to position his troops for an effective defense, neglected to strengthen his forces in the northeastern part of the island. A team of 4 Japanese crossed the water at night for reconnaissance, and on the night of December 18th, 7,500 troops followed, utilizing every small boat available. Once the 38th Division landed, they did not move along the coast towards Victoria as Maltby had anticipated. Instead, they pushed through the hilly interior, overpowering 2 Canadian battalions and splitting the island in 2. Soon, both Stanley and Victoria faced shortages of electricity and water, with much of the Chinese population facing starvation. Sir Mark Young, the governor, had already been convinced by General Maltby that holding out was futile. On December 21st, Young sent a message to London seeking permission to negotiate with the Japanese commander. Churchill responded through the Admiralty stating that surrender was not an option. Every part of the island must be fiercely defended, and the enemy must be resisted with unwavering determination. Each day you manage to hold your ground contributes to the Allied effort across the globe. Young, who felt disheartened about being perceived as the first person to surrender a British colony since Cornwallis at Yorktown, resolved to continue the fight. Despite some courageous efforts, the morale of the beleaguered defenders was deteriorating. Indian troops, particularly the Rajputs, who had faced significant losses, were in dire straits. Their spirit was further weakened by relentless Japanese propaganda encouraging defections, suggesting that the downfall of the British Empire would lead to independence for India. The Sikh police had largely abandoned their posts, their discontent towards the British exacerbated by the tragic memories of the Amritsar massacre in 1919. With raging fires and disrupted water supplies creating serious sanitation issues, the British community, especially the women, began pressuring Maltby and the governor to cease hostilities. Young remained resolute, but on Christmas Day afternoon, after the Japanese escalated their bombardment, Maltby insisted that continuing resistance was no longer feasible. That evening, the two men were taken across the harbor in a motorboat by Japanese officers to surrender to General Sakai by candlelight at the Peninsula Hotel. Admiral Chan Chak, along with several British officers, managed to escape in motor torpedo boats that night to join nationalist forces on the mainland. In the following 24 hours, the triads looted at will, particularly targeting British homes on the Peak. Although General Sakai instructed his troops to treat their prisoners with respect, the intense fighting on the island had ignited their fury. In several instances, medical staff and the wounded were brutally attacked. However, there were comparatively few reports of sexual assault against European women, and those responsible faced strict punishment, which starkly contrasted with the brutal conduct of the Imperial Japanese Army in the mainland conflict. In fact, Europeans were generally treated with a modicum of respect, seemingly to demonstrate that the Japanese were equally civilized. Yet, in a troubling contradiction to their own propaganda claiming a mission to liberate Asia from colonial powers, officers failed to rein in their men when it came to the assault of Hong Kong Chinese women. More than 10,000 individuals are believed to have been gang raped, and several hundred civilians lost their lives during the so-called holiday following the battle. General Yamashita's forces, although outnumbered, successfully established themselves on the Malay Peninsula, benefiting from the support of an armored division and air superiority. The Indian soldiers, many of whom had never encountered a tank before, were left in awe. They were also unsettled by the dense jungle and the eerie shadows cast by the rubber plantations. The most effective strategy employed by the Japanese was to advance along the eastern and western coast roads, led by their tanks. Upon reaching a roadblock, they would outflank the defenders with infantry maneuvering through the surrounding paddy fields or jungle. The Japanese advance was further accelerated by bicycle troops who frequently overtook the retreating forces. As they moved down both coasts of the Malay Peninsula, Yamashita's seasoned troops pushed the combined forces of British, Indian, Australian, and Malay units toward the southern tip of Johor. In various encounters, certain units performed admirably and inflicted significant casualties. However, the relentless retreats were exhausting and demoralizing in the face of Japanese tanks and persistent attacks from Zero fighters. General Percival consistently declined to establish a defensive line in Johor, believing it would negatively impact morale. This lack of fortified positions proved disastrous for the defense of Singapore. Nevertheless, the Australian 8th Division managed to hold back the Japanese Imperial Guards Division, disrupting their momentum with successful ambushes. A contingent of Hurricanes arrived to bolster Singapore's defenses, but they were ultimately no match for the Zero fighters. After 2 weeks of combat in Johor, the surviving Allied forces were compelled to retreat to Singapore Island. The causeway spanning the Johor Strait was destroyed on January 31st, 1942, shortly after the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders crossed it, with bagpipes playing. It is reported that the Japanese beheaded 200 Australian and Indian soldiers who had been left behind, too severely wounded to move. Raffles Hotel continued to host dinner dances almost every night, operating under the belief that normalcy would help maintain morale. Yet for the officers returning from the fighting on the Malay Peninsula, it felt more akin to music playing on the Titanic. Under constant Japanese bombardment, much of the city lay in ruins. Many families in Europe began their departures, either by flying boat to Java or aboard returning troop ships to Ceylon. Most of the men, fathers and husbands, had volunteered for military service. Some women bravely chose to remain as nurses, despite the risks they faced with the impending Japanese invasion of the city. The vulnerability of Singapore Island along the Johor Strait was exacerbated by Percival's belief that the Japanese would strike from the northeast. He was fixated on defending the naval base, which had already been destroyed, dismissing directives from General Wavell, the Allied commander-in-chief, to fortify the northwestern area of the island. This region, with its mangrove swamps and creeks, was the most challenging to defend. The Australian 8th Division, tasked with this area, quickly recognized the threat. They lacked adequate fields of fire and were short on mines and barbed wire, as most had been allocated to the northeastern side. Although newly reinforced with troops who had just arrived, many of these soldiers were inexperienced with rifles. General Gordon Bennett, while aware of Percival's significant error, chose to remain silent and retreated to his headquarters. On February 7th, Japanese artillery commenced bombardment of Singapore for the first time, the city cloaked in thick black smoke from the naval base's oil storage that had been bombed the night before. The following day, the bombardment escalated significantly on the northeastern front as a diversion, further convincing Percival that this was the expected point of attack. Observing from a tower at the palace of the Sultan of Johor, Yamashita prepared to exhaust the last of his artillery ammunition before his troops crossed the strait that night in boats and barges to reach the mangrove swamps on Singapore's northwest shore. Despite heavy casualties inflicted by Vickers machine guns, the 3,000 Australian defenders were swiftly overwhelmed by Yamashita's 16 battalions, who surged inland. The extensive Japanese bombardment had severed all field telephone lines, delaying the artillery response, leaving the 8th Division headquarters largely unaware of the situation. Even the very lights fired into the night sky by the Australian front lines went unnoticed. By dawn on February 9th, nearly 20,000 Japanese troops had successfully landed. Despite the dire situation, Percival did not make significant changes to his deployment, except for sending 2 weakened battalions to establish a blocking line. He also permitted the final Hurricane Squadron to retreat to Sumatra. Confusion quickly dashed his hopes for a last-ditch defense line northwest of Singapore City. The Japanese brought in tanks that quickly broke through any remaining barriers. Following the governor's orders, the Treasury set fire to all banknotes in its possession. Motor cars were shoved into the harbor to keep them from falling into enemy hands, but most were already burnt-out shells on the streets. The city, bombed and burning, was filled with the stench of decaying bodies, and hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded and deceased. The evacuation of women, including nurses, sped up as the last ships departed, but many vessels were targeted by bombs. Survivors who managed to reach the shore faced bayonets or gunfire from Japanese patrols. Naval vessels attempting to escape ran straight into a fleet of Japanese warships. Percival, under orders from Winston Churchill and Wavell to fight to the very end, faced pressure from his subordinate commanders to surrender in order to prevent further loss of life. He communicated with Wavell, who insisted on continuing to fight block by block. However, the city was running out of water due to damaged pipes from the bombings. Japanese soldiers stormed the military hospital at Alexandra, bayoneting both patients and staff. One man, under anesthesia, was murdered on the operating table. Eventually, on Sunday, February 15th, General Percival surrendered to General Yamashita. General Bennett, having instructed his men to unload and remain where they were, managed to escape with a group of others. They swam to a raft and, after bribing the captain of a Chinese junk, reached Sumatra. Upon arriving in Australia, he claimed he escaped to share his experiences of fighting the Japanese, but the soldiers he left behind felt understandably resentful. The blame directed at Percival, Governor Shenton Thomas, Bennett, Brooke Popham, Wavell, and others was intense in the wake of the humiliating defeat. General Sir Alan Brooke, who took over from Sir John Dill as Chief of the Imperial General Staff, noted in his diary, "We are paying very heavily now for failing to pay the insurance premiums essential for the security of an empire." Even though the planning and execution of the Malayan campaign were highly criticized, Singapore could never have been an unassailable fortress with the Japanese controlling the surrounding air and sea. Alongside the military personnel, there were over 1 million civilians on the island, who would have faced starvation eventually. On February 19th, Japanese planes targeted the port of Darwin in northern Australia, sinking 8 ships and resulting in the deaths of 240 civilians. The Australian government was understandably both furious and concerned. The country was vulnerable, as its strongest divisions were still deployed in the Middle East. Australians began to grasp their fragility the previous November, when the cruiser HMAS Sydney sank off their coast while trying to intercept the German armed raider Cormoran, which was flying a Dutch flag. During the lengthy and heated discussions that followed, and with 2 government inquiries conducted since 1998, many speculated that the German raider was not alone. They believed that the Sydney was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine operating alongside the Cormoran 18 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Australian frustration at the British failure to defend Malaya was warranted, yet the reality was that the nation had invested little in defense. Ironically, it was largely due to the intensity of Australian criticism that Prime Minister Winston Churchill was compelled to send additional reinforcements to Singapore, most of whom ultimately fell into Japanese hands. Sumatra in the Dutch East Indies was located just across the Malacca Straits from Singapore, and the Japanese wasted no time in expanding their conquests. On February 14, 1942, the day before Percival's surrender, Japanese paratroopers descended on Palembang to secure the oil fields and Dutch shell refineries. A Japanese task force, consisting of an aircraft carrier, 6 cruisers, and 11 destroyers to escort the troop transports, arrived just offshore. The island of Java was the next target. The Battle of the Java Sea on February 27th quickly resolved the situation. An Allied fleet comprising Dutch, American, Australian, and British cruisers, along with 6 destroyers, launched an assault on 2 Japanese convoys protected by 3 heavy cruisers and 14 destroyers. Over the next 36 hours, the Allied vessels were outgunned and outmaneuvered. It was a valiant but doomed effort. By March 9th, Batavia, now Jakarta, and the remainder of the Dutch East Indies had surrendered. Japanese army commanders in China viewed Burma as their most crucial objective. This was the most effective approach to cut off supplies to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, while also defending the entire western flank in Southeast Asia. Initially, Imperial General Headquarters planned to occupy only southern Burma, but this strategy quickly changed with their advancing momentum. The battle for Burma commenced on December 23, 1941, when Japanese bombers targeted Rangoon, leading to a flood of refugees fleeing the city. The Allies were supported by a squadron of Brewster Buffaloes from the Royal Air Force and a group of American volunteer pilots known as the Flying Tigers flying P-40 Curtiss Warhawks. Soon after, 3 squadrons of Hurricanes, diverted from Malaya, arrived. On January 18, 1942, General Ida Shojiro's 15th Army launched an assault from Thailand. Major General John Smith, who led the 17th Indian Division, aimed to establish a defensive line along the Sitang River, which would serve as a formidable barrier. However, Wavell instructed him to push southeast toward the Thai border to delay the Japanese advance as much as possible, seeking additional time to bolster defenses in Rangoon. This decision turned disastrous, as one understrength division was left to defend all of southern Burma. On February 9th, Japanese tactics shifted abruptly. The belief in imminent victory led Imperial General Headquarters to believe they could seize most of Burma, aiming to cut off Chinese supply routes at their origin. As Smith anticipated, he was forced to retreat back to the Sitang, which now required moving his division over a narrow, planked bridge in the darkness of February 21st. A truck jammed at a critical moment, halting the entire column for 3 hours. When daylight arrived, many members of the division found themselves in a vulnerable position east of the swiftly flowing river. As they sought to encircle them, a Japanese force moved to seize the bridge. Smith's second-in-command believed he had no choice but to demolish it. Less than half of the division managed to escape, leading to a frantic retreat toward Rangoon. The Burmese capital, protected by the Flying Tigers and the Royal Air Force, forced the Japanese to resort to nighttime bombing. Consequently, reinforcements, including the 7th Armored Brigade equipped with light Stuart tanks, were brought in through the port. Despite these efforts, Rangoon's fate was sealed, and supplies were moved north before the city was eventually deserted. A zookeeper released all the animals, including some dangerous ones, which resulted in a wave of panic. In the nearly deserted city, Governor Sir Reginald Dorman Smith and his aide enjoyed one last game of billiards after finishing off the remaining bottles in the wine cellar. To prevent the Japanese from seeing the stern portraits of previous governors, they sent their billiard balls crashing through the canvases. General Sir Harold Alexander, newly appointed commander-in-chief for Burma, arrived in Rangoon as the Japanese forces drew closer. On March 7th, he ordered the destruction of oil tanks outside the city and instructed the remaining British troops to retreat north. Luckily for the British, the Japanese failed to execute a major ambush effectively the next day, allowing them to escape. The strategy was to establish a new defensive line in the north, working alongside the 1st Burma Division made up of Karen Hill tribesmen who fiercely opposed the Japanese, and 50,000 Chinese nationalist troops under the command of the American leader in China, Major General Joseph Stilwell. Known as Vinegar Joe, he harbored a strong dislike for the British and claimed, albeit unconvincingly, that Alexander was astonished to find me, just me, a goddamn American, in command of Chinese troops. Extraordinary. He looked me over as though I had just crawled out from under a rock. With Rangoon and its port in their possession, the Japanese rapidly reinforced their army. Their aircraft, now operating from airfields in Burma, succeeded in destroying nearly all remaining Royal Air Force and Flying Tiger fighters stationed at an airfield further north. By the end of March, the Chinese forces were pushed back, and what became known as the Burma Corps, led by Lieutenant General William Slim, had to retreat quickly to avoid encirclement. Chiang Kai-shek accused the British of failing to maintain their position. Clearly, communication between the two armies was not effective, partly because the Chinese lacked maps and struggled to read the place names on the maps provided by the British. The situation worsened when Stilwell insisted on an offensive that the Chinese forces were not equipped to execute. He dismissed Chiang Kai-shek's plan to defend Mandalay as overly passive. Without informing the British, he launched 2 Chinese divisions into an attack to the south and refused to allow the 200th Division to retreat from Taungoo. The Japanese quickly capitalized on these stretched formations by advancing past them to Lashio, northeast of Mandalay, subsequently outflanking the British forces as well. Stilwell, unwilling to take responsibility for the failure, blamed his Chinese forces for their foolish hesitation to attack, missing the opportunity for a significant victory. The British had a greater appreciation for their efforts and were just as angry with Stilwell as Chiang Kai-shek was. On April 5th, a formidable Japanese task force entered the Bay of Bengal to assault the British naval base at Colombo. Admiral Sir James Somerville managed to evacuate most of his ships in time, but the damage inflicted was still quite severe. By early May, the Japanese had captured Mandalay and even advanced into China via the Burma Road, pushing some Chinese nationalist forces back into Yunnan province. However, it was the Indian civilians from the substantial community in Burma who faced the most hardship in their retreat northward, including small merchants and their families who were unaccustomed to such adversity. They were attacked and looted by the Burmese, who harbored animosity towards them. The remaining Allied troops had to pull back toward the Indian border, having sustained approximately 30,000 casualties. The Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia seemed to be complete.